Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Calev Ben-Dor. I'm the deputy editor of the Fathom journal, and I'm very, very pleased to welcome a long-term friend of Fathom and BICOM, Jonathan Rynhold, who's head of political science department at Bar Ilan. Jonathan, how are you?
I'm good, thank you, Calev. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. I'm doing okay. So you are our American go-to person, despite your very impressive British accent. So just we're recording this on Tuesday, November the 28th. It is the final day of the initial truce that it looks like is going to be extended for at least a couple more days. And Biden has been very active in kind of engaging in trying to get the hostages freed and in showing a lot of public support for Israel. And I'd probably say also trying to um, push the government to consider a political solution on the day after. We'll touch on how that's kind of playing out in America. But what do you think Biden's motivations are for what he's done so far?
There are two sides to it, and they integrate. The first is that he sees America's strategic foreign policy interests as very much in play here, in the same way that they're in play in Taiwan vis-a-vis China and in the Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia. And I'll come back to that. And the second reason is that in a visceral sense, President Biden is pro-Israel. It's deeply emotional for him, and particularly the issue of Israeli security, because as we know, he insists on taking his own grandchildren to the death camps in Poland. That is, that the Holocaust and Jewish security is something that is personally important to him. It's something that he talks about from his family history, that his father speaking to him about how important it was. So it's the combination of these two things. So if we go back to the first one, during the Cold War, America called itself the leader of the free world. And it was opposed to those states that were allied with the Soviet Union and sought a communist revolution throughout the world. That term ceased to be used when the Cold War ended. So you had Presidents Clinton and Obama talking about a new world order or a liberal world order in which countries that were not democratic could be socialized into the liberal order through free trade, through diplomatic engagement. And you had President Bush in the middle who said, well, we will bring them into this international liberal order, whether they like it or not. We will invade and we will democratize. And then finally, you had President Trump who said, a liberal world order is not an American interest. The only thing that's an American interest is protecting the American homeland and protecting America from any peer rival like China that could rise to threaten American dominance. So we find allies more of a burden than we do an assist. Now, President Biden has gone back to a Cold War-like view of things. He talks about the free world. He does not believe, in the same way that Obama and Clinton did, that engaging diplomatically and engaging through free trade and expansion of trade will socialize dictatorships into democracies. And it's noticeable that when he speaks to the leaders of China or Russia, he calls them dictators publicly. Even when he says, I had a good conversation, I respect this leader, he calls them dictatorships. So that's the first thing. He sees the world divided. The second thing, and in this he contrasts very much with President Trump, is that he believes that America's national interest requires it to be internationalist, requires it to have allies. And you can think of it like this. America can either wait till threats grow and come close to the US, or it can deal with them when they're smaller and further away. But the problem with dealing them when they're smaller and further away is America cannot be everywhere and do everything. And there's always the danger it can get sucked in like it did in Vietnam or in Afghanistan or in Iraq.
Forever wars.
So, forever wars. So what does President Biden say? President Biden says, look, we need allies to maintain, not to extend, but to defend the free world. And who are those allies? They are the most stable, strongest, most loyal and reliable allies. NATO, yeah? South Korea, Japan, Australia. And he's been strengthening all these relationships. And when we look at the whole global balance of power, we see three threats to the free world. China, Russia. Now, they're not selling any ideology other than we want to make the world safe for autocracy. Yeah. But to do that, they destabilize democracies. So those are two threats. And the third threat is radical Islamism. And there are three places in the world which America needs to defend, three nodes, in order to keep a balance of power that protects the free world. One is the Far East, where China is. One is Europe, where Russia is. Those are the biggest parts of the world economy where America's strongest allies are. And the third is the Middle East. And the Middle East in of itself really only has one reliable ally to the US, and that's Israel. But it's important because of oil. Because if oil ceases to flow out of the Persian Gulf, the world's economy will collapse. And if the world economy collapses, there will be chaos throughout the world, political, international. Imagine a world with not enough electricity, factories closing, masses of people losing their jobs, currencies collapsing. So maintaining the flow of oil is critical, and making sure a hostile power doesn't get hold of that oil is critical. Therefore, America needs to make sure that at least for the next 25 years, if not longer, which is how long fossil fuels will remain extremely important to the world economy, America needs to ensure a balance of power in the Middle East against radical Islamism, against China and Russia. Now, China is dependent on Middle Eastern oil, right? It's the biggest customer both of Saudi Arabia and of Iran. So if you're America and you're trying to balance China, controlling the Persian Gulf is a really, really powerful lever that's really, really easy to defend, right? It's a very, very narrow stretch that can cut off supplies. Think of the Suez Canal as well, okay? The alternative would be to police the whole Indian Ocean, okay? So the ability of the US to use the fact that it already dominates the Middle East, that affects the balance of power in Asia. And because of the embargo on Russian oil, it also affects the balance of power in Europe, because Europe is buying less oil and gas from Russia. So when America looks at the Middle East, it is trying to put together an alliance of moderate countries that are pro-American. So that's Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Jordan. Now, apart from Israel, these are not democracies, and they're not even close to democracies. But they are all trying to become freer, right? They are looking to modernize their economies. There is more individual rights, more freedoms for women. It's less about where they are and more about which direction they want to go. And that is as opposed to Iran and its allies, which want to create an extremist religious dictatorship. So maintaining that balance of power is very important. And this is where Hamas and Israel come in. Because right now, the Americans were close to bringing Saudi Arabia and Israel together, normalizing those relations, and then sort of strengthening the pro-American balance. Already there's military cooperation between Israel and the Gulf Arab states and Egypt through what's called CENTCOM, which is the American military command for the Middle East. And Israel only joined a couple of years ago, and it's considered by Israelis extremely, extremely efficient, really a force multiplier for Israel and for the Americans, because for every bit that Israel and the Arab states do, America has to do one thing less. And when you're Joe Biden and you're faced by an American public that doesn't understand why America needs to be involved in the world, not really, then the cheaper you can make it and the less that you have to do, the easier it is to keep the three balls in the air, the Middle East, the Far East, and Europe. And it's particularly important to show that you stand by your allies because they're so critical, and particularly when you're withdrawn from Afghanistan and Iraq. Not reliable allies, not stable countries, not democracies. America gets out of those places because it can't do anything constructive there. It's just a dustbin dragging in resources. The trouble is that when you pull out, your credibility is up for question. And that's why Biden has been really, really quick to, number one, say on becoming president, America will protect Taiwan. And everyone said, wait a minute, you don't have a treaty with Taiwan. You haven't had one since 1979. So Biden said it 4 times in the next 12 months. When the Russians invaded Ukraine, he was already stating it was going to happen. He got the whole of NATO on the same page. He visited the Ukraine to demonstrate the credibility of that commitment to allies. Same with Israel. He was 2 aircraft carriers right at the very beginning here to deter Iran, to deter a regional war that could challenge the balance of power in the Gulf, as we were talking, is very important. And he came here himself. And what he was trying to say, is yes, America can't be everywhere and do everything, but where we have strong allies who share our values, we will help them to help us to protect the free world. And in particular here, one needs to think about this. Iran and Hamas get a lot of power from the fact that they claim to represent authentic Islam in a world of 1.8 billion Muslims. Okay? Now, what would happen if Saudi Arabia, the keeper of the holy places, the most prestigious Muslim country, makes peace with Israel, normalizes its relations? There would then be 2 competing versions of Islam. One which is trying to be freer, that is trying to allow more space for women, that is able to coexist with a Jewish democratic state in the Middle East, and another that can't and won't. And if you're Iran, it's a real problem because you're a Shia state, and the vast majority of Muslims in the world in the Middle East, around 85%, are Sunni. So without a common enemy like Israel, it's very hard for Iran to gain support. So this was a strategic threat politically to Iran and Hamas. So I hope that answers the first part of your question.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think it's interesting because generally what you're saying is the support, the deep support of allies is the alternative to overstretch and forever wars. But I'm interested to what extent Biden is indicative either of, I mean, you touched on this, the American public, and there's an election in 2024, and I think I'd be interested to hear from you. To what extent do you think Israel Gaza will play a role in that re-election, and to what extent he's also indicative of the Democratic Party as a whole these days?
So there are certain advantages of having a very old president. And one is been there, seen that, done that. Biden came into office just before the Vietnam War, just before the end of the Vietnam War. He became a congressman in 1972, and America reached a peace deal in 1973. And so on the one hand, he understands the idea of containing threats and defending threats. On the other, of not wasting your resources in Vietnam, Afghanistan. I would have to say that his strategic instincts are unique to him. What was very, very common. So every president, from Harry Truman at the beginning of the Cold War and the creation of the State of Israel, all the way through to the end of the Cold War, to George H. Bush, Bush's father, with the exception of Jimmy Carter, they all understood their world that way, right? Every single one of them. They had differences, but they all understood it that way. And because it was visceral for them, right, that they remembered what happened when America was isolationist, the Second World War and the Holocaust, right? So they were very decisive in using force and in their diplomacy, just like Biden was. He didn't have to think. He instinctively knows what he thinks and what America needs to do, which is why he can act so quickly. If we now look at American politics, it's a very long time since we had a president who can discern when to engage and when not to engage, and how to engage. You need to use force, but you have to use it in a way that is civilized. And that's what he said to Israel. And he said, if Hamas takes the aid, we'll stop giving the humanitarian aid, right? He really has a very clear view. Unfortunately, the growing view in the Democratic Party, particularly among its younger supporters, is much more isolationist. It's much more pacific. It doesn't understand why you might need to use force in the world. And even though there are many centrists who intellectually can understand Biden and support him, particularly his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, it's not visceral for them. It's not part of their being. And that's very important because the emotional resonance affects the will of a leader to stick it out when you're unpopular. And to be able to respond very quickly. So if we looked at the Republicans, we can see there's also a more isolationist Trump-like wing among the Republicans. And it's difficult to know how they would react because they might react in a favorable way to Israel, not for strategic reasons, but for religious, cultural, and domestic political reasons. Or they might not. They might make do with, powerful rhetoric, but not sending actual material support to Israel. And among the Republicans who are more interventionists, they're the ones that took America into Afghanistan and Iraq, and they lacked the discernment to know, okay, when do you do this and when do you not do this? As to whether this will affect Biden in an election, 99% of the time, foreign policy doesn't affect American presidential elections unless American soldiers are actively engaged in combat. And, that's what having allies is all about, not having to do that. The only other case may be that in a close contest, there may be a relatively small number of voters who could swing a state. So There are certain areas in a number of swing states like Michigan where there's quite a high percentage of Arab voters who generally vote Democrat. And it's possible that that might affect things, or it might push younger voters who are more on the left of the Democratic Party to vote for a third party candidate like Jill Stein, who in the past, from the Green Party, who in the past has probably cost the Democrats a presidential election by taking, a few million votes. A small number, small percentage, but enough to change things around. So I think that's more or less the way it will be. But we don't even know whether Biden will actually be the Democratic Party candidate. So who knows?
So we'll bring you back in a bit under a year. Within the year, we'll have to bring you back. If I could just move to the American Israeli or the Biden Netanyahu government relationship. I think there was a report today that someone in the administration had said that if the IDF want to fight in the south, that they shouldn't move the people like they did in the north. I think Biden and the administration have really emphasized that the PA need to have a role in the day after, which the Netanyahu government has been very much against. So for the time being, everyone seems to be in the same place. But looking ahead, I'm interested how you see this playing out, both if the IDF decides, which has said it has, to continue the operation, and the day after, whatever that means, the differences between the administration and the Netanyahu government, how you see that potentially playing out.
I think the first thing to focus on is the depth of agreement on getting rid of Hamas, which is sometimes lost. If you remember, the first thing that President Biden said, and he got the European leaders of the main European countries, France, Germany, Britain, and Italy, to say it as well, Hamas must be defeated. Okay, we can't allow radical Islam to get away with this. It'll destabilize the Middle East and perhaps even Western societies. Now, that means that so long as the IDF can make the case to the administration that it is doing every single thing it can to minimize civilian casualties and suffering, the Americans will be content, right? So there may well be lots of arguments over the details, but so long as there's a sense that that's what Israel is doing, I think the operation will go ahead unless there's some massive disaster that no one can predict. So I think on the military side, things look good. There is one problem on the military side, and that is the increasing pressure for a ceasefire. The reason he's putting so much emphasis on what is your end game, what is your post-Hamas picture of Gaza, is because the better picture that the Americans can present in terms of we're going to actually make it a lot better for Palestinians in Gaza, the easier it is for them to support and get support diplomatically for Israel finishing the job, both in the Arab world and in the rest of the Western world. And so the Netanyahu's government's opposition to really articulating any kind of view that could help President Biden to help Israel to finish the job is really damaging. Having said that, the mood of the Israeli public right now is not exactly to be generous to the Palestinians. That doesn't mean that they want to deliberately make life horrible for Palestinian civilians, but the idea of presenting a vision which Israel will have to pay for in some way, diplomatically, politically, economically, is difficult for the public to swallow. But if this goes well, and President Biden will have a lot of political capital in Israel, and having offered so much help, I'm sure he'll have a fair amount of leverage. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great. Listen, Jonathan, we could probably continue discussing for a long time, but I think instead we'll stop, and we'll have to try and get you back another time. Thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to speaking again soon.
Thank you, Calev.